I'm Sandy Knapp, and I'm the current president of the Linnean Society of London. And for those of you who don't know the Linnean Society, the society is one of the oldest learned societies devoted to the study of natural history and the natural world in the world. And our vision is a world where nature is understood, valued, and protected. And what we aim to do is to inform, involve, and inspire people about nature through both our collections, our programs, and our publications, and also through the expertise of our wide fellowship. Now, this means that our fellows at the Society are a really important resource to help us achieve this vision and really achieve that mission. So if you are not a fellow of the Linnean Society, please do go onto our website, think about becoming a fellow. It's a great group of people. It's composed not only of academics, but of people from all walks of life. And people in the Society have a real passion for the natural world and a passion for all the exciting things that go on in it. So if you haven't heard of the Society, please do go onto the website and check it out. And if you aren't a fellow, please consider applying for fellowship. It's not difficult, and we really welcome people with diverse views and really want to be as inclusive as we can be going into the future, because it's only through diversity and inclusivity that we're actually going to achieve some of that conservation optimism that Martin's going to talk about this evening. So it's really my great pleasure to introduce Martin Harper tonight. He has 25 years of experience in conservation leadership. First at the Royal, well, first with various things, but most recently with the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And now he's currently the Birdlife International's regional director for Europe and Central Asia, supporting the work of these BirdLife partners in some 45 countries. He's served on lots of different boards. He has a really interesting take on conservation and on the way we can actually look at some of the activities and those practical things to see where there is a case for some optimism. We often talk about conservation as a doom and gloom thing, but actually, I think that if we can go forward into 2022, in this year when the UN summit will be held in China, and we'll have new targets for biodiversity conservation and protection, that really injecting a bit of optimism is going to help us all a lot. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say, Martin, and I will hand over to you, and thank you so much for coming.
Great, thanks very much, Sandra, and lovely to be here. I'm giving this talk tonight on optimism, 3 days after what some people have called Blue Monday, supposedly the gloomiest day of the year. Now, whether you believe that or not, the facts are that the days remain short here in the UK. Christmas is behind us. We've probably haven't got much money. It's incredibly cold, and spring feels a long way away. To be honest, the pandemic has been so awful over the past 2 years that every day's pretty much felt like Blue Monday or worse. And as Sandra says, if you are perpetually bombarded with stats about the parlous state of the natural world, then that misery can sort of move into eco-anxiety, which is a real and growing problem, especially amongst young people. But against this backdrop, this evening, what I want to do is I want to try and make the case for conservation optimism. The central idea that I'm going to present is that conservation is not just about monitoring the decline in the natural world, although we do that, and I'll say a little bit about that later. It's also about improving it. And it's because that we have made things better, that should give us confidence and indeed hope that we can turn things round for the future. And my inspiration really came from a fantastic book by Professor Andrew Bomford from Cambridge University, who's a great friend of BirdLife. And he told some great conservation success stories from around the world. And more recently, I've been really interested and supporting 2 new movements that have emerged, both Earth optimism and also conservation optimism. And they're really both designed to showcase conservation success and inspire people to do more. And because my belief is that optimism is actually a great motivator, And I think that this quote from Helen Keller really gets the spirit of why optimism can be useful for us. Optimism is the faith that can lead to achievement, and nothing can be done without faith and without hope and confidence. So what am I going to cover this evening? Well, it's really, my talk is in 3 parts, and I'll probably speak for about 40 minutes or so. I am going to talk about the current state of nature, because you can't gloss over it. You have to face up to those facts. I'm going to give you some good news stories, and I'm going to trot through some. Hopefully, many of you will know some of them, but hopefully a few nuggets will be new to you as well. And then I'm going to end with what I believe are conditions for future optimism. And to a certain extent, you will be the judge as to whether I've converted you or not. And it is very possible by the end of the talk that you won't want to be a disciple of this movement, and then you'll more likely to believe in what Voltaire said, which is optimism is the madness of insisting that all is well when we're all miserable, and my brackets, and nature is doomed. So a little bit about me. You heard from Sandra that I've been around the conservation world for the last 25 years or so. I've been lucky enough to work for many non-governmental organisations, Plantlife International, and you heard 10 years at the 17 years at the RSPB, the last 10 as their conservation director. And I moved across to Birdlife 6 months ago. And yes, I'm lucky enough now to be regional director for Europe and Central Asia. For those of you who don't know Birdlife, well, we are the largest and oldest conservation partnership in the world. And we're made up of 115 independent national NGOs, all committed to bird and nature conservation. And that, of course, includes the RSPB, which is the UK partner. And that's my region. As Sandra says, I've got something like 45 partners in 44 countries or territories, and it ranges from Iceland in the north to Kazakhstan in the east, and Israel in the south. And our mission really is to try and keep species common, to prevent threatened species from coming extinct, and to ensure that we as humans continue to benefit from everything that nature gives us. And we've obviously got a particular expertise in birds, and for us they act as ambassadors for the rest of nature. This little diagram sort of tries to explain how all our work comes together, and you can see obviously we obviously see the world through birds, but our 2 core foundations are our partnership, those 115 incredible organisations who we support and collaborate with, but also science. As you'll hear more, the Birdlife itself invests a huge amount in documenting, monitoring, documenting what's happening to the state of birds, but also in terms of trying to identify and monitor what's happening to the world's most important areas for biodiversity. And then the things, the 4 areas wrapping around our foundation, these are really our 4 themes. So on species, we try to take action to recover threatened species. Sites, we want to protect the most important areas for biodiversity. Systems, we want to change the system so that human activity works in harmony with nature rather than against it. And of course, society, to try and inspire people about the natural world, but also to try and mobilize them to call for change so that we can make things better. So that's us. And so now turning to the reason why we exist, and therefore the first part of my talk. So this is the gloomy bit really, and the 2 most up-to-date global assessments of the state of nature were published in the last couple of years or so. So the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report of 2019, and then the UN's Global Biodiversity Outlook report, which came out in 2020. And both of them really tried to take stock of where we are, and the Global Biodiversity Outlook was actually a formal report which was looking at how nations around the world were performing against the targets that had been set under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And really the 3 main messages, the punchlines on these reports are that, nature and everything that it offers us it's deteriorating worldwide, and that the drivers of change are accelerating. And unless we take transformative action, that any attempt to meet new goals in 2030, and Sandra mentioned that at the beginning, just won't be achieved. So that really is, that's really where we are. And what I'm going to do is briefly just bring this to life a bit with a few examples from the detailed monitoring that goes on. Because for many conservationists, the ultimate currency of success is species. It's what's happening to species, whether we're able to stop them from going extinct. And of course, we are heavily reliant on the red lists that are produced by the IUCN. And those of you who don't know the red list system, essentially it's a way of categorizing different species according to their risk of extinction, through to least concern on the left, all the way through to pretty endangered, extinct in the wild, and extinct. And in 2010, the world agreed a target to try and help species so that by 2020, the extinction of known threatened species would have been prevented, and their conservation status, particularly of those most in decline, would have been improved and sustained. And sadly, the 2020 assessment, which was reported with the Global Biodiversity Outlook, revealed that species continue to move on average, closer to extinction. And this is borne out by this graph, and I've got a few graphs, not too many, and hopefully that's okay for all of you. But what this graph is essentially showing, it's an amalgamation of all the red lists over the last few years and trying to basically depict what is the trend in red list status. And essentially what this is saying at a global, whether it's at a global level, the dotted line, or the regional level, the coloured line, we're seeing a long-term deterioration in species. Essentially, a greater proportion of species are now at risk than there were, on this graph, which is on the left-hand side, is from 2000. And the latest IUCN assessment, which was always produced in December, came out just before Christmas, didn't bring a lot of cheer on that one, of the more than 142,500 species which the IUCN has now assessed, something like 40,000 species, or 28%, they are all threatened with extinction. And Birdlife is the global authority for producing the red list for birds. And at a global level, we now report that something like 1 in 8 of all bird species are at risk. And we've repeated that exercise recently at a European level, looking at 544 bird species across 50 nations on our continent. And the headlines are here. Again, 1 in 5 bird species categorized as threatened or near threatened with extinction. 1 out of 3 bird species declined over the last few decades. You can see the groups of species which are most threatened and faster declining. That's seabirds, wildfowl, waders, and raptors, birds of prey. And the area, the habitats that have the highest number of threatened species are farmland and grassland birds. And long distance migrants are declining faster than other birds. So this pretty much tells us where we need to focus our efforts in my region over the coming years. Yet extinction risk is just one measure of success. And not only do we want to prevent threatened species from becoming extinct, as I said, our mission is really also about trying to keep common species common. And increasingly, our scientists have been able to assess change in abundance over time, and many of you will be aware of WWF's Living Planet report, which is done in collaboration with the Zoological Society for London. And they've tracked changes in species abundance, looking at something like 21,000 populations of 4,300 vertebrate species. And as you can see from this graph, overall, the index has shown a decline of 68% since I was born in 1970, and that essentially means that vertebrate species populations today are under 1/3 the size that they were, when I was born. And just before Christmas, a publication produced by scientists at both the RSPB and Birdlife, and indeed our Czech partner, they tried to assess what's happened to total bird populations across the EU 27 countries and the UK. And they concluded that today there are 600 million fewer birds than there were in 1980. And that's the left-hand graph. The top right-hand graph shows that the overall net change in green for species, but also the blue line basically shows some have declined, that's left of the 0 mark, and some have gone up, but on balance, the overall change is negative. And you can see the bottom right-hand graph shows the overall rate of change for all the species for which we have abundance data. So that data was stark. It basically tries to conceptualize just what the scale of loss is, even if species aren't going extinct. And so much of that data was compiled thanks to the Pan-European Bird Monitoring Scheme, which is a partnership of the European Bird Census Council, Birdlife, RSPB, and again, the Czech Society for Ornithology. And they're producing indicators such as this is the European Wild Bird Indicator. And essentially what you have here is that the red line is those species which are faithful to farmland. You have the green line, forest birds, and then you have the blue one, which is all birds. And that data set is incredibly important for trying to influence policy. And sadly, it's matched by the data that we have for the UK. And many of you will be aware of this. The colours are slightly different, but essentially you can see the farmland bird graph bouncing along the bottom. And this is compiled through the British Breeding Birds Survey and the partnerships there listed: British Trust for Ornithology, the RSPB, and the government body for the UK, Joint Nature Conservation Council. And in a sense, the reason it's so important to have this information is to help us to work out what do we need to do. And historically, birds have been, they've led the way in monitoring, partly because they're popular, they're relatively easy to see and to identify, and there's a really rich tradition of both expert volunteers working with professionals to try and contribute the data. And many of you on this call might actually contribute to some of these surveys. And just in the UK for the BBS, something like 3,000 volunteers now take part every year, and they're contributing this data for free in an expert way, and it's why we have this incredible data set. And actually, globally, I checked this stat the other day, there's more than 10,000 members of the IUCN species specialist groups now, and they are the ones who are really helping to maintain the red list information. But also what they're beginning to be able to do is to try and use their expertise to try and understand the drivers of decline. And so in 2018, I should have said that obviously this is what a real person looking at birds looks like, and we're in a room here just looking at a screen, but this is what the real thing's all about. Yeah, so what I wanted to say was these experts have also really helped us try and understand the drivers of decline, and this little bubble chart depicts the significance of the different reasons why bird species are declining, and we looked at 1,469 globally threatened species and made assessments of what were the main reasons for their decline. And of course, the larger the bubble, the greater the significance of the risk. And I've just sort of characterized them really. The top two, which is around agriculture and loss of forest, is really about unsustainable consumption and production. So that is us as a species consuming more, clearing more land so that we are out-competing nature. And then the next three categories won't be a surprise to you: non-native invasive species, particularly problematic in islands; overexploitation, which reflects hunting and trapping, both on land and at sea; and then, of course, climate change, which, of course, is growing as a major risk, and it's probably the most extreme form of pollution. So, you know, I've rattled through all of that and made you a little bit gloomy, but, you know, I wanted to sort of make the point that, yes, conservationists have been done quite a good job at monitoring declines. But, you know, as this slide demonstrates, we haven't stopped there. We have actually moved on to try and work out why they're in trouble. And then, of course, that is the first step to trying to do something positive about it, and to try and target conservation in the right way. So how are we going to just deal with this appalling state of nature? And what I'm going to give you is I'm going to give you three good news stories which are all about species. And I'm going to talk about Asian vultures, I'm going to talk about albatrosses, I'm going to talk about bittern, and then I'm going to add another story about large-scale habitat restoration, which can deliver for both wildlife and for carbon. And my hope is that that gives you some confidence that we have made things better, and that therefore, hopefully, we can offer a brighter future. And what I want you to do, really, when you're listening to these stories, is to think about, even if you know these stories really well, think about what you think has made the stories a success, and how transferable are these lessons? What do you think it means for the future of nature conservation? So, please have that in mind as I try and whiz through these stories. But let's start with Asian vultures. I mean, many of you will know this story. I mean, the Asian vulture populations crushed in the mid-1990s by as much as 99%, meaning images like this are pretty much confined to the history books. And not only was it terrible news for the vultures, it was also really bad news for society, because vultures perform an incredible task in clearing up cattle carcasses, which are traditionally left on the outskirts of villages. And to put this into some sort of perspective, during the 1990s, there was something like 100 to 160 million vultures, and they were cleaning up 20 million tons of carrion. And so 99% decline in the vulture population essentially means a 99% decline in the natural carcass disposal system, which is just enormous, really. And these figures are across large parts of South Asia. And there's consequences to that sort of massive change. And one of the things that's happened is there's been a 30% increase in feral dogs. And unfortunately, the rise in feral dogs has also been led to the rise in disease. And so whether it's anthrax or tuberculosis, or increase a higher incidence of infection, through dog bites, of rabies. And something like 20,000 cases of rabies are recorded in India. That's something like 60% of all documented cases around the world. And I think we've estimated that the healthcare costs of dealing with all of this is something like $34 billion if they did it well. And actually the costs of recovering vultures are a whole lot cheaper than that. So the key question which was facing the conservation community at the time was, why were the vultures crashing? And like any conservation story, any conservation problem we face, the first thing to do is to understand the reasons why species are declining. And a number of hypotheses were put up to try and explain why the vulture populations were crashing. And in the end, it was actually down to the Peregrine Fund, which identified the prime driver of decline being this veterinary drug, diclofenac, which was being used in cattle. And of course, we determined, or Peregrine Fund determined, that that was toxic to vultures when they were scavenging the cattle. So this resulted in a huge ban to a huge campaign to try and ban the use of diclofenac. And the campaign was successful in part because we were able to make the case that there were some less toxic alternatives, which still did the right job for cattle, but weren't toxic to vultures. And that was thanks to a fantastic bit of research, which was done basically looking at how vultures, and we use the African whiteback vulture, which is not a conservation concern as the trial birds, but essentially we looked at how vultures responded, and particularly the levels of levels of uric acid to diclofenac, which is the red, and then also an alternative drug, meloxicam, which is in blue. And essentially what this graph is saying is you get a spike in uric acid in vultures when they've essentially been exposed to diclofenac, and you don't get that in meloxicam. So essentially this helped make the case that there were alternative drugs available which would work for the cattle, but would not be toxic for vultures. And that was hugely influential in actually making the case for the ban. And then, as you can see from this graph, which is it's a log scale, but it still shows you the sort of hockey stick graph which we want to see in conservation, whereby there's been an uptick in, for example, white-rumped vultures based on monitoring that we've done, pretty much driven by the ban in diclofenac. So in parallel with this campaign to get rid of diclofenac and all the research which went into trying to find the alternative replacement drugs, Birdlife's two oldest partners, the Bombay Natural History Society and RSPB, worked together to try and establish a breeding program to try and help safeguard and bolster the wild vulture population while also tagging and monitoring some of these birds. And this has proved incredibly useful, because unfortunately new drugs have emerged on the market which are actually toxic to vultures, and it helps us understand where there is new risk. But also we've managed to establish a really good monitoring program of the vulture populations. And this is beginning to pay off, as we were able to report late last year that Nepal has declared the world's first truly safe vulture safe zone. And we've come up with this definition really to try and describe those areas around surviving vulture populations where diclofenac is banned or any vulture toxic drug is banned, and where the vulture populations are doing well and where we have confidence that vulture survival rates are high. And what this image shows is the boundaries of the vulture safe zone in orange, bordering India, which is the yellow border is the national border, and then the grey dots show where 17 tagged vultures were recorded. And you can see that pretty much the vulture safe zone covers the whole area where those tagged birds went, which gives us real confidence that that's going to be a safe haven for vultures in the future. So there's a huge amount of work still to do, but today there's something like 24 organizations operating in 6 countries in Asia, all doing their bit. And with that, hopefully we'll get a really positive future, allowing vultures to recover. My second story moves on, takes place at sea, and it's about albatrosses. Again, it's all about the transcontinental effort to try and recover this incredibly iconic group of seabirds. And sadly, these, despite being covered by national and international law to protect them, back in 2014, the problems were so severe that 17 out of the 22 albatross species were, when they were assessed with the red list, they were basically assessed as being threatened with extinction. And like vultures, their reasons for decline were detected in the 1990s, and it was pretty much due to the rise in high seas fishing of tuna species and Patagonian toothfish, and the way in which these new fisheries were taking off was using long lines which either floated to the surface or were set along the seafloor. And sadly, what happened, of course, is that the birds basically were attracted by the bait, and then they got hooked and they drowned in huge numbers. As you see here, 160,000 to 300,000 seabirds a year are estimated to be killed through this form of bycatch, and included 100,000 albatrosses each year. So, I mean, bycatch is a problem in pretty much all fisheries, and I've only seen this image recently, and it shows all the different sorts of fishing practices that go on around our seas, and then the number of species which are affected by the different forms of fishing. And so if you look at C and D, the pelagic longline, which is D, and the demersal longline, which is C. And you can see that just the large numbers of species which are affected by these species. So our response was, again, for RSPB to join forces with Birdlife to create an albatross task force. And that was really designed to do 3 things. Firstly, to research and develop techniques for reducing bycatch, reduce the number of birds that have been killed. Secondly, to work with fishermen to roll out these mitigation methods. And third, advocacy at both a national and a regional level to try and mandate the use of bycatch mitigation techniques. And the results have just been absolutely fantastic. Starting in South Africa, we've worked to roll out these mitigation methods, and I don't know if you're aware, but one of the things we managed to put in place are these so-called Tory lines, and what they can do is they distract birds when they're putting the bait out, and so the birds don't get them before they descend a certain depth. And we've seen something like a 98% reduction in the South African fisheries, and very, very recent, in 2020, we reported in Namibia something like a 98% reduction. So loads of birds being saved, and on average, there you are, 90% fewer birds being killed as a result of the activity of the Albatross Task Force. And probably the best sign of success was that when the Albatross group was being reassessed for the extinction risk, only 15 out of the 22 were assessed as being at risk. That means 2 were downlisted, including the black-browed albatross, which when I chatted to Ollie Yates, who leads this program for Birdlife and RSPB, he said that's pretty much because the waters where black-browed albatross go is where the Albatross Task Force has been active. So again, huge amount of work over the course of more than a decade, multiple partners coming up with practical solutions to tackle, which has been a really chronic conservation problem. My third species, I want to come much closer to home because I think it's one of the UK's greatest comeback stories. And you probably know the story, but I really like telling you it because it's what I think is the best example of a single species targeted conservation success story. So the bittern used to be relatively common in the UK into the 19th century. Then a combination of habitat destruction and persecution meant we lost it. It became extinct. It then recolonized in the 20th century, and we had something like, I think, 80 pairs before the population started crashing again, pretty much as a result of drainage of wetlands. And by the mid-1990s, there are only 11 booming males in the UK. And so, to see one back then, it was really special, really rare, create quite a fuss if anyone saw one. But the sign of huge success is today, if you see a bittern, it's not such a big story. And in fact, you might even may not get any commotion in a hide, because there are now something like 200 boomers across the whole of the UK. But this success didn't happen by magic. Yeah, I mean, some people take this story for granted, but back in the mid-90s, this was a serious problem. And when the bittern was listed on Annex 1 of the EU's Birds Directive 35 years ago, the UK was given an obligation to provide put in place measures to try and improve its favourable conservation status. This helped to secure political commitments by successive governments and also to set targets. And the UK Biodiversity Action Plan, which was first published, I think it was 94, by John Gummer, Conservative Secretary of State at the time, that was in response to the Earth Summit 92, came up with essentially set targets for species like bittern, which were needed to be met over the subsequent decade. And the RSPB was at the forefront of these efforts, and there's maybe a myth, but I believe there was even a moment when the chief executive at the time, Barbara Young, now Baroness Young, threw her papers on the table and said to the management board of the RSPB at the time, I want bitterns and I want them now. Well, fast forward 25 years or so, we do have bitterns, and that's partly because, thanks to EU funded work, we created new reed bed habitat. We learned how to turn carrot fields into functioning wetlands like in Lake and Heath. We managed to turn old peat extraction sites into wonderful wetlands, places like Hamwall, and as a result of that, we created 1,500 hectares of bittern. And all of that, it's great for the bittern, but it's also great for other species, whether it's water vole, great white eaglet, or rare invertebrates as well, such as small dotted footman moth. So all of that again done in partnership with the likes of the National Trust, the Wildlife Trust, and Natural England. And it just shows what you can do when you work together. And I can't move on from this story without a shout out to the incredible RSPB site managers who essentially have helped provided, I suppose, the engine of growth of the bittern population. And basically what this graph is saying, that the blue and the yellow strands, they were existing reed beds that essentially were around, and the blue ones, they were at risk from coastal flooding. The yellow ones, they were safe from coastal flooding. But the most important growth of the graph is rebeds created since the mid-1980s that are safe from coastal flooding. As you can see, you know, more than a third of the UK population now on RSPB nature reserves. What have we learned from these 3 species recovery stories? Well, you'll have your own views, but here are my 5 lessons I brought out. Science drives action. Saw that with diclofenac being identified as the driver of vultures decline. Lasting change takes time, so stick at it. All 3 stories are over multiple decades. Success depends on strong coalitions. You cannot do this on your own. Every organisation needs friends. Regulatory change can eliminate threat. Certainly saw that when it came to the Albatrosses, and also it can provide the impetus for action, as happened with the EU Birds Directive. Monitoring and reporting sustains momentum and interest, and that is certainly the case. I think that's how you manage to keep conservation moving over a number of years. So I know what a number of you will be thinking is we don't have enough time to invest this level of effort to turn around all species at risk, but it is useful to know what the role of species recovery is in terms of determining its role in the future. But in fact, the IUCN itself has been embracing a little bit of conservation optimism, and it's come up with its own IUCN Green Status of Species list, basically trying to document which species have had progress made because of conservation, even if they're still reliant on conservation today. And interestingly, a recent study which was published in Conservation Letters by University of Newcastle, and also including my colleagues in Birdlife Science and Stu Butchard, they estimated the number of bird species which essentially through conservation action have had species extinction averted. And what we've managed to show, and it's a complicated graph, essentially a list of species and moving towards the right, the confidence that the scientist has that conservation action has helped. And what they've done is they've estimated that conservation action prevented 21 to 32 bird and 7 to 16 mammal extinctions since '93, and that the similar progress has been made over the last decade, and that crucially extinction rates would have been between about 3 and about 4 times greater if it hadn't been for conservation. Now, obviously, they concluded that a lot more is needed because some of these species are still critically at risk, and they basically argue need a step change. Well, so how do we deliver the step change? And I'm just going to move on to my final good news story. And I'm going to travel to West Africa. I'm going to the border of Sierra Leone and Liberia, and I'm going to talk about the work in Gola Forest, where Birdlife and RSPB have been actively working with partners for the last 35 years ago or so. It's an incredible place. It's part of the Upper Guinean Forest, which is one of the world's top 35 global biodiversity hotspots. It's absolutely rammed full of really important threatened species, and we've been working there for say for about 35 years or so, through 2 civil wars, through Ebola, through the COVID crisis, and we're sticking at it. And the sort of species you might see, if you're lucky, are Gola malimbi, top left, white-necked Picathartes, bottom right, a pup of a pygmy hippo, and western chimpanzee. And western chimpanzee, rapidly declining species, and Gola is one of the few places where its population is actually stable, thanks to the designation as a national park. It's also really, really important for carbon, which is no surprise. In 2014, established West Africa's first reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation project, which essentially is all about capturing and valuing and then selling the carbon content of the forest, while also working with the 114 communities that live in and around the forest. And there we've done a huge amount of work to train up local communities in sustainable forest-friendly farming techniques such as cocoa, which has helped us produce chocolate, which you can now buy in the UK. It's really tasty, but more important than that, it actually tells a really big, important lesson to UK, which is the 4th largest chocolate consuming nation on the planet, and that it is possible to eat chocolate and save a rainforest. And in fact, you know, so much of the threats facing wildlife relate to consumption, and one of the calculations that NGOs have made, Greenpeace at the EU level says that EU consumption is responsible for more than 10% of global forest destruction, and some research that WWF and RSPB did show that something like 2,800 species are at risk from UK consumption, just looking at 7 commodities grown in and around forests. So our consumption is driving real decline. But given the fact that forests are home to something like 74% of the world's threatened species, up to 20% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions comes from deforestation, we're still losing forests at a rapidly declining rate. It was right that at COP26 a focus was put on trying to halt the loss of forests, and so the declaration for land use was really important. And the Glasgow Climate Pact actually recognised the importance of protecting and restoring ecosystems, demonstrating that essentially you've got to take action for both climate and biodiversity at the same time. And the good news is now that some countries are moving. The EU is consulting on its regulation on deforestation-free products, and also actions being taken place in the UK, and a piece of legislation I'm going to talk about in a moment. So yeah, the climate and ecological emergency is combined. We've got to tackle it in an integrated way, and many countries, even local authorities are declaring that we face an emergency. And what some have now said, and the Convention on Biological Diversity is stating itself, that we need to ensure that we invest in nature because of the carbon value that it offers, and calculating something like 10 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions can be saved through action to save nature. And for time reasons, I'm going to move on this, but it basically reinforces the need for 30% of land and sea to be protected by the end of this decade. So we're in this decade, the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So I've tried to say that there are many examples, and I've only listed 4 stories about how conservationists have improved the natural world. There's many of them out there. Please go on the Conservation Optimism and Earth Optimism websites to look at them. But I'm just going to end by really saying what I think are the 10 key conditions for future success. These are the conditions for conservation optimism. So the first thing is to get the targets right, so that we bend the curve and so that we have a nature positive future. And you can see we've now got the conservation community united behind essentially what we're calling for a global target to be agreed at the meeting in China, hopefully this year. So we do bend the curve and have more nature tomorrow than we have today. They then need to be turned into regional or domestic law. We've got a good track record of this at European level. We had to fight to defend the nature directives just 7 years ago. 500,000 people signed up to that. And now that coalition has been campaigning for a new EU biodiversity strategy, which has got some pretty good targets coming through, including the proposal to establish a new law to restore habitats, as well as embracing 30 by 30 and taking action for species. We've done the same at Westminster level. The NGO community rallied hard. We have an Environment Act for the first time ever to have targets to try, legally binding targets to try and halt the loss of biodiversity. We didn't quite win the battle for restoring it. And then a whole bundle of conditions really all about money. Ending perverse subsidies, whether it's agriculture, which is unsustainable agriculture, or fossil fuels, making sure that there's more state money going into conservation, reforming private sector investments so investors and indeed consumers have confidence that their money is doing good rather than harm, and of course businesses changing their business models so that the businesses of tomorrow, which go fast in terms of pro-nature activity, whether it's renewables in harmony with nature or regenerative agriculture, they get the market advantage. And then a really important part of practically fixing our planet, I think, is to map it, to map those areas which are really important for carbon and for nature. And if you want to know more about what the RSPB is doing here, go onto their carbon mapping sites and you'll see what they've done to do coincidence mapping of carbon and wildlife areas at UK and also in West Africa. And it's really a tool potentially for decision makers to say, where would we target our discretionary effort to get the best returns? And potentially some, perhaps even carbon will be a criteria for new protected areas in the future. And then for our own sector, we've got to work better with our philanthropic community to have a shared strategy. But I also think that governments should be thinking about investing in a skill strategy for nature conservation. I'm using this slide from Cyprus because I think, oh my goodness, we're good at industrial strategies for engineers, but we just need, which are putting pressure on the natural world, we need the commensurate type of investment of effort to try and rebuild nature over this decade. And the final the final condition really is to harness the public anger and passion that exists. Thousands of people were marching around Glasgow, the global COP. There's going to be, thousands of people around the world clamoring for the right choices and targets to be set at the CBD when it meets later this year. And we've got to find ways to put pressure on politicians to make sure they make the right decisions, but also to encourage businesses to change. So they're my top 10 conditions. You'll have your own, all about global targets translated into law, lots about money, mapping, building our sector for the future and harnessing public anger and passion. And, I remain optimistic about the future, but in many ways, I'm a conditional optimist. I don't have blind optimism. And I was really struck by a quote by the Nobel Prize winning economist, Paul Romer, who said that complacent optimism is the feeling of a child waiting for presents. Conditional optimism is the feeling of a child who's thinking about building a treehouse. If I get some wood and nails and persuade some other kids to help do the work, we can end up with something really cool. So I suppose my message is let's work together and do something really cool to restore nature over the next decade. Thank you very much.
Martin, thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating talk, and started out a bit sad, but we really ended up in a good place. That last thing you were talking about harnessing that passion, there's been lots and lots of questions, so apologies in advance for anybody whose question doesn't get asked. Someone's asked the question, is there a tension between this conservation optimism idea and the demands of people like Extinction Rebellion, people like George Monbiot, to tell the truth about the ecological crisis? Who's right, or does a mixed messaging thing work the best? So what do you feel about that?
It's a great question, and it's when I've worked, all the NGOs I've worked for always have a debate about what do you dial up? Do you dial up the threat, or do you dial up the positivity? And there's different people are motivated by different things. Anger and passion can be a motivator, but for some that will be a turnoff. So that the sort of the best construct that we ever came up with every story we talk about, we say nature's amazing, it inspires us, but it's in real trouble. But together, here's some solutions to how we can make things better. And I think a lot of people want those practical solutions to feel like they can make a difference. And that's the Helen Keller quote, I think. But I think people are motivated by different things, and actually we need a spectrum of activity out there to put the pressure on. So yeah.
So really kind of, let's try to do as much as we possibly can at both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah, and work out when to dial things up and down. And, we're going to be setting some targets and hopefully translating into laws. And then we've got to get into the mode of solutions. We've got to roll up our sleeves and actually, restore the habitats, restore the species population. That requires action, and people can help with that. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question from somebody thinking about your two examples, going back to the vultures and things, is working with stakeholders, both the kind of, local people, but also the kind of fishermen, seems to be a really crucial aspect of those first two examples of yours, finding viable alternatives for local producers with this cultural importance of the vultures. So how important do you feel? I mean, it's kind of, yes, stakeholders are really important, but are stakeholders always that important, or were those examples outliers?
So I think so having the national government, the local community, and local businesses all on side, that's your ideal. And if you alienate one, it can be problematic. In Andrew Bamford's book Wild Hope, I mean, one of the really interesting things was when you've got conservation going in line with the culture of what the local community is doing, then you've got a really strong chance of being successful. So if you haven't got that culture, how do you create that culture? And that often means you need to have sustainable livelihoods. You need to find a way where the people living around that nature are going to want to look after it. And so, yeah, I mean, pretty much, you know, I know within Western developed Europe, sometimes we see some stakeholders as enemies, but actually in many ways, it's only together if we can get genuine, sustainable, I suppose, use of the natural world, which will give us a chance of actually saving it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and somebody else has asked, has commented that it seems that species have to be on the brink of extinction before action is taken, perhaps mainly policy action. So does that pose greater challenges for restoring species to a favorable conservation status, i.e. beyond that initial recovery? And then there's kind of an ancillary question about what would the ideal population of bitterns be in the UK? Kind of two questions in the form of one.
Yeah, so I think it is. So pretty much what conservation community has tried to do is to determine which of those species which are most threatened and which are worthy of targeted action to recover them. That's where you throw the kitchen sink at sort of your head case species. But equally, your no regrets action is to basically deliver what Professor Sir John Lawton has said, which is to build bigger, better, more connected, protected areas, larger areas of semi-natural and natural habitat, and really connect that. And that will basically give you your maximum chance for many species to do well. But for some species, unless you take that really detailed action and targeted action for it, they won't get protected through those means. So in a sense, that needs to be a comprehensive strategy around targeted species actions for the most threatened, while at the same time, you know, a solid conservation approach for restoration while addressing some of those key drivers. And in terms of the great question of how many do you want, sadly, decision makers and conservation community over the last 30 years have categorically failed to define what we should have defined, which is favourable conservation status. We've set targets, which is about sort of taking us forward, but actually there's a piece of work which is going on now, which I believe actually there's even an advert for the job, which Natural England and RSPB are doing for England, to try and calculate for all bird species what should be the favourable, essentially what should be a favourable reference value for our wild bird populations. And it's important to know that, because you can then say, well, how far do you need to go before recovery? And if you have more, then it helps you determine the relative impact of a particular development. And that's important, obviously, when we're trying to move the economy at the same time as looking after nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another question, there's tons of questions, and I'm going to try to riddle some of them together and ask them not in exactly the words that people have asked them, so we can kind of get to as many as we can. Is sort of bird diversity is basically driven by landscape homogenization. And so are farming sectors in Europe ready to employ more people in deploying several different kinds of eco-technologies to improve integrity? So are people really looking at stewardship of farmlands across Europe?
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant question. Yeah, I completely agree. My belief is that success is partly about scale and heterogeneity. So that's the opposite of homogeneity. Yeah, I mean, I think Europe is categorically, and with that I mean Europe in a continental sense, is categorically failing to reform agriculture. And we despite investing in things like wildlife-friendly farming grants, agri-environment schemes, which have definitely put a bit of messiness back into our farmers' fields, that has not been sufficient to turn around the grass that I showed earlier. So definitely different approaches are required. And I think the social dimension is really important. I was delighted to hear from our Spanish partner recently. They've started looking at wildlife-friendly olive growing, and they basically showed that small-scale olive growing, which is wildlife-friendly, better managed for wildlife, is delivering better profits. So both, high quality yield, better profits, and I don't know the job story, but I can imagine that's also good from a jobs point of view as well. So, it'd be wonderful that was rolled out across the Mediterranean, but it's just one example. But I think this is still massive unfinished business.
Yeah, somebody has asked a question about the olives, and you've just answered that in your last example, which is really, really great. And someone's asked kind of a really kind of local down home question is, do you think we'll soon have red kites helping to reduce organic waste in London? Because they seem to be on their way.
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't use the very kite story, but it is a wonderful conservation success story. And again, take it for granted that you see, I see kites many days over here in Cambridge. But of course, their population shrunk to a small population in Wales. And it was only thanks to a reintroduction programme, which happened in about 5 or 6 places across the UK, that we got the big numbers. Yeah, I mean, black kites in some population, for example, you do see doing their, in large numbers and helping with scavenging. But hopefully our waste management system in the UK remains strong enough without having to rely on a natural scavenging system.
It'd be nice not to have piles of garbage in the street, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. Let's try and avoid that.
Yeah, so there's lots and lots of messages about great talk and really, really inspiring messages. But there's this is a question that kind of adds to one of the ones I asked earlier, and it's about language that we use when we're talking to people. So if we use doom-laden language, many people switch off. But if we're too upbeat, they think everything's fine and worry about something else instead. So how do you balance that communication to kind of get it right so that people actually pay attention, don't switch off, and don't think everything's okay?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's hard. It's why I use the phrase conditional optimism. So we can be optimistic about the future if these things are in place. And I think, whenever I hear about incredible conservation story that my colleagues have been involved in, the thing I always want to know is why. What made it work? What's the recipe for success in the future? What can we learn from that? And I hope that the whole conservation community gets better at saying the reason why this went well was because people worked really hard, there was some money, business changed their behaviour, whatever it was, laws came in place, which means that in the future we need these things. So that's my belief about how we do the comms. But there's much better comms professionals than I wrestling with this issue.
Okay, and yeah, someone said, please show the UK bird indicator with the y-axis starting at 0 and not 40.
Oh, sorry about
that. So that's just a kind of like a comment more than that. So the person who asked about this kind of stakeholders has put a kind of additional question in here saying, should an overall objective linking all of these, interventions be to work with all stakeholders, especially the communities? And conservation has often rightly been criticized for colonial attitudes. And how do we break that cycle?
Yeah, I mean, it's still a very, very lively debate, and some are very worried about, for example, the 30 by 30 agenda and what that might mean for Indigenous people and local communities. And so, there are some mistakes that the conservation world made historically, but I think we're getting better. And so, for example, one of the things, using the Gola example, one of the things I really like about the way we've set up that whole national park really is we've created a legal entity, which is a partnership between the national government, the international NGO, which essentially is the RSPB, the local community as well. So the chiefdoms on board as well, the local partner. So you've got 4. You've got the local community, the local partner, international NGO, and you've got the national government. And I think that sort of means that there's a voice at the table for everyone. And I think that's crucial for its future success as well.
Great. Okay, so yeah, and we've kind of there's a suggestion on someone's put in this is for people who are watching. There's information on UK global impact and a sort of dashboard that people can play with, which is really great. And there's a lot of people have put in that they really like this idea of conditional optimism and complacent optimism, and that's they sound so similar, but there's such a different kind of view of that. And the last question that we have kind of goes back to the beginning, not back to the complete beginning, but also someone's asked is, could this whole drop in farmland birds basically be down to the Common Agricultural Policy?
Yeah, agricultural policy over the last, since the 70s or so, has been the major driver of loss. And so the UK vote to leave the EU was obviously an opportunity to reform agriculture and do something very, very different. And so essentially the 4 countries of the UK are offering an experiment on behalf of the EU 27 to see what happens if you're freed up and you can do what you want. I don't think it's going as well as we would like at the moment. So although I've been out of the domestic scene for a little bit, I think that even though there are some very good words about trying to ensure that all public money supports delivery of essentially wildlife friendly farming in England, for example, that's not coming through at the pace we think it should. But there is a chance to do things very differently, and hopefully people will embrace it.
A little bit of passion injected there by all of us, I think, might help a little bit. So I think that sounds great. So let's take that conditional conservation optimism out there and really deploy it. And some of those 10 kind of things to do and 5 things, those are really great things to have, to be able to do that. So I just want to thank you very much again for coming along and giving us a talk. And for those of you who are interested in coming to our next talk at the Society, which is next week. It's next week at 6 o'clock. It's one of our nature reader talks, and it's called Crooked Cats, Beastly Tales from India. And the subtitle is Why Do Some Big Cats Prey on Humans? So it could be a really exciting one. It will be a really exciting one. And I'm really looking forward to it. And Martin, thank you so much for coming along. And I think it's inspired a lot of really interesting questions and a lot of thoughts, certainly in my mind, about ways we in the Society can help with some of these things and do some of these actions to really increase a lot of optimism. So thank you very, very much for the lecture tonight, and also for inspiring all of us. Thanks.